Marcel walked slowly along the street, his footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestones. Autumn in New York painted the trees in shades of gold and red, creating a surreal contrast with the timeless elegance of the historic buildings lining the street. For Michael, however, this beauty was only a cruel reminder of the magnitude of changes in his life over the past 2 years. At 58, Michael bore the weight of a life that seemed to have collapsed overnight. His once youthful and lively face was now marked by deep wrinkles and a poorly trimmed gray beard. His eyes, once bright and full of hope, now seemed opaque, reflecting the fatigue of countless nights spent sleeping outdoors. As he walked down the street, Michael couldn't help but notice the imposing house on his right. It was a magnificent building with its Art Nouveau facade and tall windows shining under the autumn sun. For a moment, he let himself imagine what life would be like in such a place, sheltered from the cold and rain, with the certainty of a hot meal every night. Lost in thought, Michael barely noticed the door of the mansion opening. An elegant family emerged, their laughter and animated conversation cutting through the air like a sharp knife into Michael's heart. He watched them discreetly, partially hiding behind a nearby tree. The father, a tall, well-dressed man, adjusted his tie while talking on the phone. The mother, a graceful woman in a dress that surely cost more than Michael had earned in his lifetime, held the hand of a little girl who was skipping joyfully. "Daddy, can we get ice cream on the way?" the little girl asked, her childish voice full of impatience. The man hung up the phone and smiled at his daughter. "Of course, sweetheart, but first, we need to stop by the office to pick up some documents." Michael observed the scene with a mix of admiration and envy. Not so long ago, he too had a family, a job, a life. Today, he had only painful memories and the daily struggle to survive on the streets of New York. As the family headed towards their luxury car parked on the street, Michael couldn't help but think about how he had ended up in this situation. 2 years ago, he was a respected executive at a wine company. He had a comfortable suburban home, a modest car, and savings for a peaceful retirement. Then, like a house of cards, everything collapsed. First, there was the company restructuring. Despite his years of dedicated service, Michael was laid off. "Necessary cutbacks," they said. At 56, finding a new job proved almost impossible. His savings quickly dwindled. Then, as if fate wanted to test his resilience even further, illness struck. His wife, Mary, was diagnosed with cancer. The treatments were expensive, far beyond what insurance could cover. Michael sold everything he could, his car, his furniture, even his wedding ring. But it wasn't enough. Mary passed away on a rainy spring afternoon, leaving Michael alone and devastated. The debts piled up, and soon the bank repossessed the house. Within a few months, Michael found himself on the street with only a backpack containing his few remaining belongings. Today, on the streets of New York, watching this happy and prosperous family, Michael felt the weight of each day of the past 2 years, every missed meal, every cold night, every scornful glance from passers-by. All of it weighed on his shoulders like an invisible but unbearable burden. The family's car drove away, leaving behind only the soft hum of the engine and a cloud of exhaust. Michael sighed deeply, adjusting his worn backpack on his shoulders. He knew he had to continue his daily quest for food and a safe place to sleep, but something held him there, staring at the mansion. For a brief moment, Michael allowed himself to dream. What if, by some miracle, his life could change again? What if, just as he had lost everything in the blink of an eye, he could regain it all the same way? But as quickly as the dream came, it dissipated, carried away by the autumn breeze rustling the leaves of the trees. Michael shook his head, as if to chase away these useless thoughts. He knew there was no point in dreaming. Reality was harsh and unforgiving, and he had to face it day by day. After one last glance at the mansion, he began to walk away, his steps echoing in the almost deserted street. Michael was about to leave the mansion behind when a movement caught his attention. The front door opened again, and the elegant woman he had seen earlier came out quickly, carrying a luxurious Louis Vuitton handbag. She walked determinedly towards the trash can next to the sidewalk. Without hesitation, she opened the lid of the trash can and threw her handbag inside. Michael frowned, intrigued by the scene. Why dispose of such an expensive bag? His curiosity was interrupted by the sound of an approaching car. The family was back. "Honey, are you ready?" called the man from inside the vehicle. "Yes, just a moment," replied the woman, fixing her hair and giving the trash can one last glance before getting into the car. Michael watched the vehicle drive away, its engine purring softly. As soon as the car turned the corner, he found himself alone on the street. The sun was starting to set, coloring the sky in shades of orange and pink, but Michael barely noticed the beauty of the evening. His eyes were fixed on the trash can. Years of living on the streets had taught Michael that opportunities rarely presented themselves twice. Glancing quickly around to make sure no one was watching, he approached the trash can, his heart pounding with each step. "Don't be foolish, Michael," he told himself. "What do you hope to find? Scraps from a feast that will never be yours?" But even a faint glimmer of hope pushed him forward. With trembling hands, he opened the lid of the trash can. The smell of household waste hit him, but he paid it no mind. His eyes were fixed on the Louis Vuitton bag, partially covered by old newspapers and empty wrappers. Michael hesitated for a moment. Digging through trash was something he often did to survive, but never in such an upscale neighborhood. What if someone saw him? What if the police were called? "Be brave, old man," he whispered to himself. "What do you have to lose?" He carefully removed the bag from the trash can. Despite its presence in the trash, the item still exuded an air of luxury and sophistication that seemed completely out of place in his calloused, dirty hands. Michael glanced around again, feeling exposed on the street. Deciding it would be safer to examine his find elsewhere, he slipped the bag into his worn backpack and quickly walked away, blending into the growing shadows of dusk. Walking through the streets of New York, Michael felt the weight of the bag in his backpack as if he were carrying a precious treasure. He thought about all the possibilities it offered. Maybe he could sell the bag and get enough money for a decent meal or even a few nights in a hostel. Finally, he reached a small park where he usually slept hidden behind some bushes. Michael sat down on the ground, his heart pounding, and opened his backpack. The Louis Vuitton bag gleamed in the faint twilight. Michael examined it closely, admiring the quality of the leather and the metal details. He had never touched anything so luxurious in his life. With trembling fingers, he opened the zipper, wondering what he might find inside. Money? Jewelry? Something that could change his luck? But what he saw left him momentarily perplexed. There was no money or jewelry, just a single item, an old photo album. Michael frowned, disappointed. A photo album? Why throw away such an expensive bag if it only contained that? Curious, he took the album. It was heavy, bound in leather worn by time. The edges of the pages were yellowed, indicating that the album was several years old. Michael hesitated to open it. For a moment, he felt as though he were intruding on someone's private life. But curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he opened the cover. The first page contained a single photograph. Michael adjusted his eyes to the dim light to see better. It was a picture of a young woman smiling at the camera. That smile seemed strangely familiar to him. Intrigued, he turned the page. More photos of the same young woman at different stages of her life: child, teenager, young adult. With each image, Michael's heart beat faster. There was something about this woman, something he couldn't explain, but that made him uneasy. Then his eyes fell on one particular photo. The young woman in her 20s stood next to a man. Michael started, recognizing himself in the image. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice trembling with emotion. The realization hit him like lightning. This wasn't just any album. It was filled with photos of his daughter, Sarah, whom he had lost touch with over 10 years ago. Michael felt tears welling up in his eyes. With trembling hands, he flipped through the album, absorbing each image, each moment of Sarah's life that he had missed. He couldn't believe his eyes. In his trembling, wrinkled hands, he held a piece of his daughter's life, a life from which he had been excluded for so long. Every page of the album was like a window into a world he had lost, a world where Sarah grew up, smiled, and lived without him. "My God," whispered Michael, his voice choked with emotion. "Sarah, my little girl." The tears started flowing freely now, and Michael wiped them away quickly, fearing he might damage the precious photographs. He examined each image carefully, as if he could make up for the lost years through these frozen moments in time. There were photos of Sarah at her high school graduation, proudly holding her diploma. Michael regretted not being there to cheer her on. Others showed Sarah traveling, exploring places Michael could only dream of visiting: Paris, London, New York. His daughter had seen the world while he struggled to survive on the streets of New York. One photo, in particular, caught his attention. Sarah, dressed as a bride, beamed next to a tall, well-dressed man. Michael touched the photo gently, as if he could feel the happiness of that moment through the paper. "My girl got married," he said softly, a sad smile forming on his lips. "And I didn't even know." As he turned the pages, Michael noticed that the photos became more recent. Sarah looked more mature, more elegant. In some images, she appeared in front of a grand house that Michael immediately recognized. It was the same mansion on the street from where the bag had been thrown. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Sarah lived there. His daughter had been so close all this time, living a life of luxury and comfort while he had been buried in the streets, homeless and hungry. Michael felt a confusing mix of emotions: the joy of knowing his daughter was healthy, the sadness of having missed so many important moments, and a twinge of bitterness that he immediately felt ashamed of. "Don't be foolish, old man," he reprimanded himself. "You should be happy for her." Continuing to flip through the album, Michael reached the last pages. The most recent photos showed Sarah with a little girl, probably his granddaughter. Seeing the smiling face of the child, so similar to Sarah when she was young, made Michael's heart ache. "A granddaughter," he murmured, tracing the outline of the girl's face with a trembling finger. "I have a granddaughter." Then something fell out of the album. A yellowed envelope slid onto Michael's lap. He picked it up carefully and noticed his name written on the front in Sarah's delicate handwriting. Heart pounding, Michael opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from years ago. His hand shook so much that he could barely hold the paper. The letter began, "Dear Dad," and Michael had to stop for a moment, swallowing hard before continuing. "I've been looking for you for so long. After Mom's death and your disappearance, I wanted desperately to find you. I hired detectives, placed ads in newspapers, asked all your old friends and colleagues, but you seem to have vanished. Dad, I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I know that losing Mom was hard for you, just as it was for me. But I needed you, and I still need you. If you ever read this letter, please contact me. No matter how much time has passed, no matter what has happened, you will always be my father, and there will always be a place for you in my life. I love you, Sarah." Michael let the letter fall, unable to contain the sobs now shaking his body. Sarah had searched for him. She still loved him. She still wanted him to be part of her life. And he, in his despair and shame, had hidden from the world, believing that everyone had forgotten him. "Oh, Sarah," he cried, clutching the album to his chest. "Forgive me, my dear. Forgive me." Alone in the park under the faint light of the stars, Michael wept for all he had lost and all that could have been. But amidst the pain, a small flame of hope began to grow in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rebuild the bonds that had been broken so long ago. Michael sat in the park for hours, alternating between looking at the photo album and rereading Sarah's letter. Each word, each image was like a piece of a puzzle he was desperately trying to put together in his mind. The night wore on, but he didn't notice the cold or the darkness enveloping him. With trembling hands, Michael picked up the letter again. The moonlight filtering through the leaves of the trees illuminated it just enough for him to read the words his daughter had written so many years ago. "Dear Dad," he read softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "It's been 5 years since you disappeared. 5 long years of tireless searching." Michael paused, swallowing hard. 5 years. Sarah had spent 5 years looking for him while he wandered the streets, lost in his misery and self-pity. He continued reading. "I remember the day Mom died like it was yesterday. The pain in your eyes, Dad, was unbearable to see. I wanted to comfort you, but you closed yourself off. And then one day, you were gone." Michael closed his eyes, recalling the dark days following Mary's death. The pain had been so intense, so overwhelming that he couldn't bear to look at Sarah, seeing in her the reflection of her mother. "At first, I thought you needed time. I waited for you to come home, to call me. But the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. That's when I started actively searching for you." The letter detailed the efforts Sarah had made to find him. She had hired private detectives, published ads in local and national newspapers, and even participated in a television show dedicated to finding missing persons. "Each false lead, each unsuccessful search broke my heart a little more," Sarah had written. "But I couldn't give up. You're my father, and I love you no matter what." Michael sobbed softly, tears staining the paper. How could he have been so selfish? How could he have abandoned his daughter when she needed him most? "Dad, if you're reading this, know that it's never too late. No matter how much time has passed, no matter what has happened to you, I want you back in my life. I have so much to tell you, so many moments to share." The letter then described important events in Sarah's life, her marriage to a man named Philip, her work as a lawyer, the birth of her daughter, Amelie. "Amelie has your eyes, Dad. Every time I look at her, I see you. She asks questions about the grandfather she never met, and my heart breaks not being able to give her answers." Michael looked up at the starry sky, feeling the weight of years of regret on his shoulders. How could he have deprived his granddaughter of knowing him? How could he have deprived himself of knowing her? "I know there must be a reason for your disappearance." The letter continued. "Maybe the pain was too much. Maybe you thought you were protecting us somehow. But Dad, nothing could be worse than your absence." The final lines of the letter were a desperate plea. "Please, Dad, if you're reading this, contact me. No matter where you are, no matter the situation you're in, I love you and want you back in our lives. There's always a way to come home. All my love, Sarah." Michael carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. His heart was heavy with regret, but also with a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. Sitting alone in the park, Michael made a decision. He would find a way to contact Sarah, no matter how difficult, no matter the shame he felt about his current situation. His daughter wanted him back, and he wouldn't let her down again. With renewed determination, Michael packed the album and the letter into his battered backpack. Tomorrow, he would begin his journey back into Sarah's life. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, Michael felt he had a purpose. Looking at the stars one last time, he whispered, "I'm coming home, Sarah. Dad is coming home." In the days following the discovery of the album and letter, Michael was torn between hope and fear. The idea of reuniting with Sarah after so many years filled him with a thrill he hadn't felt in a long time, but the fear of being rejected or disappointing her again paralyzed him. Determined to find a way to approach his daughter, Michael spent his days near the mansion, observing the routines of the house where Sarah now lived. He carefully chose his observation points, alternating between different spots to avoid drawing attention from the residents or security in the neighborhood. One sunny autumn morning, Michael found a bench in a square that overlooked the house. Sitting there with his shabby appearance and worn clothes, he looked like just another homeless person resting in the shade of the trees, but his eyes were vigilant, watching every movement of the household. Around 9 a.m., the front door opened. Michael's heart raced when he saw an elegant woman step out. Even from a distance, he recognized her immediately. Sarah had inherited her mother's graceful posture, but Michael could see traces of himself in the way she walked, in the quick gesture with which she fixed her hair. Sarah got into a luxury car parked in front of the house and drove away. Michael let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Seeing his daughter, even from a distance, filled him with a mix of joy and pain that almost overwhelmed him. The hours passed slowly. Michael stayed at his post, ignoring his hunger and thirst, his attention entirely focused on the house, waiting for another glimpse of Sarah or her family. In the middle of the afternoon, another car stopped in front of the house. Michael sat up straighter, observing this scene closely. A young woman got out of the vehicle, carrying a small child in her arms. The little girl was probably 4 or 5 years old. "Amelie," Michael murmured, recognizing his granddaughter from the photos in the album. The young woman rang the doorbell and was greeted by Sarah, who opened the door with a smile. The two women chatted briefly before entering the house with the child. Michael was intrigued. Who was this young woman? A nanny? A family friend? He made a mental note to see if she reappeared in the coming days. As the sun began to set, Michael saw Sarah return home on foot this time. She walked to a small shop at the corner of the street and came back a few minutes later with a grocery bag. Michael watched her enter the house, noticing how relaxed and happy she seemed in her environment. The days passed, and Michael learned the household's routine. Sarah usually left early in the morning and returned in the late afternoon. The young woman with the child showed up 3 times a week, always at the same time. One particularly cold afternoon, Michael saw something that made his heart leap. Sarah was leaving the house with Amelie, both bundled up against the autumn wind. The little girl skipped joyfully beside her mother, her crystalline laughter reaching Michael's ears even from a distance. "Mommy, can we get hot chocolate?" Michael heard Amelie ask as they passed his bench. Sarah smiled and stroked her daughter's hair. "Of course, sweetheart, after we visit the bookstore, okay?" Michael watched them walk away, feeling a sharp pain in his chest. There was his family, so close yet so far. He could just get up, go to them, and introduce himself. But fear paralyzed him. What if Sarah rejected him? What if she was horrified to see what he had become? What if Amelie was frightened by his appearance? Days turned into weeks, and Michael continued his vigil, gathering the courage to make contact. He observed the subtle changes in the family's routine, noticed the Halloween decorations being put up on the house's facade, watched the leaves on the trees change color in fall. Each day, Michael mentally rehearsed how he would approach Sarah. In his most optimistic moments, he imagined an emotional reunion with tears of joy and warm embraces. Other times, he imagined Sarah slamming the door in his face, rejecting him completely. As autumn gave way to winter, Michael knew he couldn't postpone the inevitable any longer. The intense cold made his nights on the street increasingly dangerous. Moreover, the desire to reconnect with his daughter and meet his granddaughter grew stronger every day. Finally, on a cold December morning, Michael made his decision. Today was the day. He would approach the house and ring the doorbell. No matter what happened, at least he would have tried. Heart pounding, Michael rose from his usual seat and began to walk towards the mansion. Michael approached the mansion hesitantly, his heart pounding in his chest. With each step, he felt the weight of the years of absence and regret. The Christmas decorations adorning the house's facade seemed to mock him, reminding him of all the festivities he had missed in his daughter's life. Standing in front of the imposing oak door, Michael took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. His trembling hand reached for the doorbell and hovered there for a moment before pressing it. The melodic sound echoed inside the house, making Michael jump. For a moment, he considered running away, fear threatening to overpower his determination. But he stayed, remembering the words in Sarah's letter. "There's always a way to come home." Footsteps approached on the other side of the door. Michael held his breath, his body tense like a bowstring. The handle turned, and the door opened. A middle-aged woman appeared, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of Michael. For a moment, there was only silence, a mutual recognition hanging in the air between them. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was just a whisper, full of incredulity and emotion. Michael felt tears well up in his eyes. "Sarah," he managed to say, his voice breaking. "My little Sarah." Sarah raised her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Is it really you? After all this time?" Michael nodded, unable to speak. The silence stretched between them, years of absence and unanswered questions hanging in the air. Finally, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes searching her father's aged face. "Where have you been? Why? Why didn't you ever contact me?" The pain in her voice was palpable, making Michael wince in shame. "I didn't know how," he began, the words coming out haltingly. "After your mother died, I was lost. I thought you'd be better off without me." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "Better off without you. Dad, we needed you. I needed you." Michael hung his head, the weight of his mistakes crushing him. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry." There was another moment of tense silence. Michael braced himself for rejection, expecting to be turned away from Sarah's life once more. But to his great surprise, he felt his daughter's arms wrap around him. "Oh, Dad," Sarah sobbed against his shoulder. "I've looked for you for so long." Michael returned her embrace, his own tears flowing freely now. "I know, my dear. I found your letter. It gave me the courage to come." Sarah pulled back, looking at him with a mixture of confusion and relief. "My letter? But how?" Michael explained briefly about the discarded bag and the photo album. Sarah listened, her eyes widening with realization. "I threw that album away weeks ago," she said softly. "I thought I'd never see you again, that it was time to move on." Guilt struck Michael again. "Sarah, But Sarah interrupted, gripping his hands firmly. "It doesn't matter anymore, Dad. You're here. That's all that matters." At that moment, a child's voice called from inside the house. "Mommy, who's at the door?" Sarah turned and quickly wiped her tears. "It's your grandpa, Amelie. Your grandpa has finally come to visit us." Michael felt his heart leap at her words. His granddaughter, the one he had watched from afar for weeks, was just a few steps away. Sarah turned back to Michael, her face a mix of emotions. "Do you want to come in and meet Amelie?" Michael hesitated, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance and worn clothes. "I don't know if I should. I don't want to scare her." Sarah smiled gently and squeezed her father's hand. "Your family, Dad. Your appearance doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here." With his heart filled with a mix of fear and hope, Michael nodded. Sarah opened the door wider, inviting him in. As he crossed the threshold, leaving behind the cold street, and entering the cozy warmth of his daughter's home, Michael felt like he was taking the first step on the road to redemption. The path ahead would be fraught with obstacles, with many difficult conversations and wounds to heal. But for the first time in years, Michael felt that there was hope. Michael entered the house hesitantly, his eyes scanning the elegant interior of the mansion. The contrast between the luxury surrounding him and his shabby appearance made him feel out of place and ashamed. Sarah, aware of her father's discomfort, gently guided him to the living room. "Sit down, Dad," she said, indicating a comfortable sofa. "I'll call Amelie to make us some tea." When Sarah left the room, Michael found himself alone with his thoughts. With trembling hands, he touched the soft fabric of the sofa, feeling like a trespasser in a world he no longer belonged to. A few moments later, Sarah returned, holding the hand of a small brunette girl with curious eyes. Amelie looked at Michael with a mix of curiosity and shyness. "Amelie," Sarah said softly, "this is your grandpa. Do you remember the stories I told you about him?" The little girl nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Michael's face. "Are you Mommy's daddy?" she asked in a small voice. Michael felt a lump in his throat. "Yes, sweetheart," he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm your Mommy's daddy." Amelie stepped forward, still holding Sarah's hand. "Why didn't you come to visit us before?" The innocent question hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. He looked at Sarah for guidance, but she just nodded encouragingly. I got lost for a while, Amelie," Michael began, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes adults make mistakes, and it takes them a long time to find their way back home." The little girl seemed to ponder this for a moment before asking, "But now you've found your way?" Michael felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, I've found my way." A tense silence followed, broken only when the housekeeper entered with a tray of tea. Sarah poured the tea, her hands slightly shaking. "Dad," she said, her voice thick with contained emotion, "there's so much we need to talk about, so many questions I need to ask." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of years of absence. "I know, Sarah, and I promise to answer them all. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but—" Sarah interrupted, placing her hand on his. "It's not about deserving, Dad. It's about family, about rebuilding what was lost." The hours that followed were filled with difficult conversations. Michael recounted his years on the street, the shame that kept him from seeking help, the despair that almost consumed him. Sarah, in turn, spoke of the pain of growing up without a father, the years of fruitless searching, and how she never stopped hoping for this moment. Amelie, initially shy, gradually opened up, showing Michael her favorite toys and talking about her school. Seeing the sparkle in his granddaughter's eyes brought Michael a joy he hadn't felt in years. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the room changed. The initial tension gave way to cautious hope. Laughter occasionally punctuated the conversation, especially when Amelie shared a funny story from school. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the living room windows, Sarah looked at her father with determined eyes. "Dad," she said softly, "I know we have a long way to go. There's a lot to heal, a lot to rebuild. But I want you to know that there's a place for you here if you want it." Michael felt his heart tighten at this unexpected offer. "Sarah, I don't know if I can accept. I don't deserve. It's not about deserving," Sarah interrupted gently. "It's about family, about second chances. Will you try?" Michael looked at his daughter, at his granddaughter whom he barely knew, at the life he had lost and was now being offered again. With tears in his eyes, he nodded. "Yes," he murmured. "Yes, I'm ready to try." The road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be moments of doubt, frustration, and perhaps even regret. The trust lost would not be easily regained, and the wounds of the past would take time to heal completely. But at that moment, sitting in the living room with his daughter and granddaughter, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. A fragile but real hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start over.